The Exodus, one of the biggest event in the Old Testament, where we can see how God redeems the Israelites from the Egyptians and leads them to the promised land of Canaan. In this event, we can see the mighty work of God, His miracles, and so many wonderful things in the book of Exodus. And you know what? It is not a simple thing to lead 25 lakh people from one nation to another nation. So, seeing such a great incident, this became a very difficult thing for the critics to believe. Can such a huge event be true? But you know what? This incident has a lot of archaeological evidences to support this. Hello everyone, this is Michelle, and today's episode we are gonna see the archaeological evidences to show that the Exodus was true, and by this we can understand the greatest redemption in the Old Testament is true, and that's what we are gonna see today. It's a very interesting episode. Let's take a look. In March 1898, a French archaeologist, Victor Loret, discovers a special tomb in the Valley of Kings at the country of Egypt. Now, why I call this tomb as special is because this tomb belonged to a pharaoh whose name was Amenhotep II. And you know what? This pharaoh is the same pharaoh who is mentioned in the Bible in the book of Exodus. Now, if you ask me how, if you take a look at the biblical timeline, the Exodus takes place between 1450 to 1400 BC. And if we take a look at the Egyptian timeline, the king who ruled between 1450 to 1400 BC was Amenhotep II. So, technically, if these both timeline match, then the pharaoh mentioned in the Bible should be Amenhotep II. Now, that's not the only evidence we have. We have a lot of evidences to support that this pharaoh was the pharaoh mentioned in the Bible. So, the first evidence which we are going to look at is when Victor Loret enters this tomb, he finds wall paintings and inscriptions written around, and he clearly sees the name Amenhotep II written almost everywhere. And then when he enters a particular room, he sees a royal coffin which is completely covered with jewels and lot of stuff. And when he opens the coffin, he finds a mummy inside which is covered with long strips of linen, and in that linen the name Amenhotep II is written. So the first evidence we get is this tomb belonged to Amenhotep II. In an Egyptian tomb, the people who belong to the royal family and also the government, in case if they died before the pharaoh was before the pharaoh passed away, their bodies will also be mummified and kept inside the same tomb. So when Victor Loret was exploring other rooms in this tomb, he came to find three more mummies, and one specific mummy was between the age of 11 to 15. And then he collected sufficient evidences to prove that this young boy was the son of Pharaoh, whose name was Weben Seno. Now, this was not a cooked up story because there were sufficient evidences to prove this. The first evidence which he collected was this mummy had a very unique hairstyle called the princess lock. In Egyptian culture, people who belong to the royal family, especially the princess, will always have a unique hairstyle called the princess lock. That is, they would shave one side of their head and other side they would have this different hairstyle. So if anyone saw the kids, saw the people, they would easily identify that that's the prince who's going over there. So this exact hairstyle was found in this mummy. This was the first evidence. The second evidence, if we need to understand this, we need to know a little bit about the process of mummification. The Egyptians always do this process so that they can, contain the corpse from decaying for thousands of years. So this body goes through a lot of processes, and in one process, what they do is that they take away the inner organs from the body, and then they store it separately in a jar called canopy jar. And inside this tomb, what they found was they found so many jars, and in one jar, this name Weben Senu was written in it. So what we see clearly here is that this particular mummy, the young boy, was the son of Pharaoh, and his name was Weben Senu, and he was inside the same tomb of the Pharaoh whose name was Amenhotep II. Now, you may wonder, how can this be related with the Bible, and what is the evidence to prove that this Amenhotep II was the Pharaoh who was mentioned in the book of Exodus? Let me explain. In the book of Exodus, chapter 12, if we read the 10th plague, we can understand this in a better way. Exodus chapter 12, verse number 29 says, "And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock." So here we make note of these two words. Lord struck all the firstborn, and next it's mentioned very clear that from the firstborn of Pharaoh. So from this verse, it is very clear that the firstborn of Pharaoh was dead. Now, how do you prove this further? This is because, according to the Egyptian culture, a tomb which belonged to Pharaoh will be permanently sealed after the death of the Pharaoh. So, this means that if the body of the firstborn, the body of Webensenu, was found inside the same tomb of Amenhotep II, then it clearly means that the firstborn was dead while the Pharaoh was still alive. Now, this clearly matches with the biblical text, and this proves that this Exodus chapter 12, verse number 29 is true, and that's what we saw right now. How amazing it is, right? The evidences whichever we saw perfectly aligns with what is written in the book of Exodus. The second evidence which we find is that this mummy, the mummy of Amenhotep II, has a lot of boils on it. You might think, what has boils got to do with this? If you look at the sixth plague, which is mentioned in the book of Exodus chapter 9, the 8th verse says, "So the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take for yourself handfuls of ashes from a furnace, and let Moses scatter it toward the heavens in the sight of Pharaoh. And it will become fine dust in all the land of Egypt, and it will cause boils that break out in sores on man and beast throughout all the land of Egypt." So, according to this text, we can see that the sixth plague which came on the Egyptians was boils, and archaeologists found that such boils were not found in any other mummy, and it was very unusual to find it on a mummy, because even though it was a boil, it would have definitely decayed, or the texture would have changed, but this particular boil did not change. So this also proves that the Amenhotep II was suffered from the boils which was caused during the sixth plague. So all these evidences matches that Amenhotep II was the Pharaoh who was mentioned in the Bible, and this in turn proves that the Pharaoh mentioned in the Bible is true, which proves the entire event of the Exodus is true. But there are some critics who point out a verse out of context and say, which is that the Pharaoh was dead in the Red Sea, which means that his corpse would have not been found, and so this particular tomb does not belong to him, saying that the Exodus might have not been true. But that's not true. If you read the verse in Psalms 136, verse number 15, the verse says, "But overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea, for his mercy endures forever." So, according to this verse, Pharaoh was overthrown in the Red Sea, but at the same time, we must also read another verse in Exodus chapter 14, verse number 30 says, "So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore." So this text clearly says that yes, the Lord did overthrow the army of Egyptians in the Red Sea, but according to this text, we can understand that everyone saw the dead Egyptians on the seashore. Now, let's picture this incident. After this, after the Red Sea crossing, after the Egyptians were overthrown in the Red Sea, if the Egyptians were coming back, few people from the government, few people who are left behind the palace, they were going to come back to see what had happened and to retrieve the dead people. They would have definitely seen the people dead on the seashore, and if that was the case, the first person whom they would have looked for and whom they would have retrieved would have definitely been the Pharaoh. So it again it is not a surprise that the body of Pharaoh was found. So all these evidences gives us only one conclusion, that the Exodus was true, And the Pharaoh mentioned in the book of Exodus was Amenhotep II, and we have clear archaeological evidences to support it. So, from this, we can conclude that the greatest redemption incident that took place in the Old Testament is true, and we have so many archaeological evidences to support that. The Pharaoh mentioned in the Bible was Amenhotep II, and by this, we can clearly understand that the Exodus was true. And after being delivered from Egypt, we know that the Israelites had crossed the Red Sea. And guess what? We have so many archaeological evidences to also prove that the Red Sea incident. And that is what we are going to see next week. From this, we can just understand one thing. And we need to remember that the Redeemer who saved the Israelites from Egypt and brought them to the promised land is the same Redeemer who redeemed us from our sins. If it's God's will, we'll see you next week, another episode of this weekly Paul program. God bless you.